Throughout the Bible, stones have helped people to tell their stories. Sarah and Abraham make many stone altars as they journey from their home in search of the promised land. After running away from his brother Esau, Jacob, Abraham's grandson, lays his head on a stone and sleeps. When he awakens after a vivid dream, he declares, "Surely this is the house of God," and makes his pillow stone an altar. In our text, the Israelite people, the descendants of Abraham and Sarah and Jacob, lay stones after they crossed the Jordan River on their way to the promised land. This is a big moment. It's a moment the people crossing the river have been waiting for 40 years. It's a moment the Israelites have been waiting for generations and generations. They've been wandering in the wilderness. Moses leads them out of Egypt through the parted Red Sea, but then he dies before they make it. And so Joshua, Moses' successor, is tasked with leading the people across the river. And the river is a powerful symbol. Crossing it meant many changes for the Israelites. They're moving into the unfamiliar and into the unknown. Their journey has been marked by transition and struggle, and this trek across the river and into a new place is no exception. I feel like we're in a pretty substantial cross the river, wade into the waters kind of season. Since last March, we've been living in a lot of new, wondering, and a lot of hard transition. We've been remaking decisions again and again and again. And sometimes we can see the other side. We have the hope of a vaccine or emerging from COVID. But even when we do, our lives and our world will be different than they were before. If not for any other reason, then we're different. Our church is in a season of transition. Our staff has shifted. We're learning to be community in new ways. We're discerning what comes next, and some of that is unknown. And each of us have our own journeys, our own rivers to cross. And in all of that, at least for me, there's both blessing and challenge, joy and grief, anticipation and anxiety. And surely the Israelites were having all of those feelings too. They'd reached the promised land, but also they had reached the promised land. It's something they'd been anticipating and yearning for so long, and they did not know what was coming next. But they also did not step into that riverbed alone. Back in chapter 3, Joshua instructs the priests to take the Ark of the Covenant and lead the way. This Ark of the Covenant symbolized the presence of the living God. God was leading the way. God was ever present. God is leading the way. God is ever present. God was present with the Israelites as they crossed the Jordan River, and God is present with us now as we wade through change and discern our own paths forward. And the Israelites crossed the river naming the presence of God, holding close to one another and telling their stories. In verse 23, they're reminded of their story. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan for you until you crossed over, as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea. They are reminded that as they were led by Moses and Miriam and Aaron out of slavery in Egypt, that God parted the Red Sea so they could pass safely. I imagine parents and grandparents telling this story to their children as they stood in front of a furious river. Remember, our God parted the Red Sea and protected us. We have survived. We are strong. They told their stories and they trusted what they knew. A few moments ago, Hudson read for us Walter Brueggemann's poetic prayer, Old Stories Become New Songs. In it, Brueggemann writes, "Give us the courage to trust what we know." As we wade into these waters of change, as we grieve our losses, as we look forward in hopeful anticipation, as we look for light, what do we know? What grounds us? Bolstered in their stories, the Israelites crossed the river, And Joshua instructs one of each of the 12 tribes present to take a stone and carry it on their shoulder to the other side. And these stones were big, they were heavy, symbolic of the weight of their journey. They were a reminder of what the Israelites knew, of what they lived and experienced, of their hopes, of God's work among them. And verse 21 says, "When your children ask their parents in time to come, what mean these stones? Then you shall let your children know. Israel crossed over the Jordan here on dry ground." These stones were their history keepers. They dug them out of the river, dried them off, and constructed a monument. In those stones, they saw the pain of where they had come from, the fear of a rushing river, the hope of a promised land, and the presence of a God who is always. And then they laid these stones down so that their children and their children's children might know what they mean, that their stories might become a part of who they are. We have our own history keepers. Some are monuments erected of stone or shawls we drape over our shoulders. Some are stories told in history class or passed down at dinner tables. Some are metro moments or red doors swung open wide. And just like the stones dug out of the Jordan River reminded the Israelites of what they knew, these monuments we create, these stories we tell, remind us of where we have been, and they teach us what we know. And so many of these stories are beautiful, but many are hard. Because what we know is not just the good news of God's love and enduring presence. There are stories that we tell, or maybe more often that we don't tell, that reveal painful truths of when we have not made manifest God's love in the world. And that's true in this story, the one we tell today about Joshua and the Israelites, and specifically what happens next after they cross the river and lay their stones. After years of wandering, they finally make it to the promised land, to Canaan. And then, in the name of God, they conquer it. It's violent, it's bloody, it's genocide. And I don't really know what to do with that, because I want to focus on just the good news of this text, the beauty of a river crossing, the telling of stories, the gathering of stones, the proclaiming of God's presence. And to be honest, when I've used this text in the past, I've just left it out. It doesn't happen until a little bit later. But it's part of the story. It's part of the context. And so I think we have to name it. Just like we have to name the parts of our own stories, our own histories that are hard, that are sinful. And when I say sinful, I don't mean what I was taught in about sin in Sunday school, that every time I tell a white lie or hold lust in my heart or work on the Sabbath that God's mad at me. I mean sinful in a more corporate sense. Groups of people entrenched in systems of corrupt and unjust power, acting in ways that are harmful, oppressive, driven by hate. I'm talking about the sins of racism, of slavery, of people coming in search of promise and religious freedom and conquering land that wasn't theirs to take. About the times often in the name of God when great harm has been done. And I'm talking about the harm being done still by those oppressive systems that are rooted in white supremacy. I'm talking about my own culpability in those systems. And so I think part of this courage to trust what we know that Brueggemann talks about in his poem is to name all of what we know, because we know what is good and beautiful and the best of who we are that has led us here. And we know what is hard, what is sinful that has also led us here. As I was preparing this week, these two parts felt really incongruent to me. Naming the good news of this text and naming the reality of what follows. How does that come together? Naming what we know that grounds us in God's presence and love and faithfulness, and naming what we know that does not reflect a spirit of truth or goodness. But then I think back to Brueggemann's prayer, because after trust what you know, he says, obey what you hope. Obey what we hope. I love that phrase. It feels like an impetus for action, for active hope that propels us more fully into the wholeness of who God is calling us to be. Hope that is birthed out of what we know. So what do we know? We know what hatred creates, what power can do. And we know that love illuminates every broken thing it finds. So what do we hope? We hope for luminous love, for active love, healing love that mends and brings in. We know the name of God has been used in vain to harm, oppress, to justify. And we know the presence of a God who dwells within our very beings, brings forth the best of who we are, wades into the waters before us. And so we hope that we might be led by the Spirit across the river to manifest the presence of a God whose good news is radically just and expansive beyond what we can understand. We know darkness, we know fear, we know loss, and we know light and goodness and community. And so we hope that we might be kindled in light, that we might wrap ourselves up in it when the shadows are too strong, that we might bear it for one another when things seem unbearable. And so I think these incongruent parts begin to come together when we hold them in hope. What we know, what we hope, has called us to gather on Wednesday nights to have hard conversations around anti-racism. For those of us who are white, to look deeply at ourselves, at our church, to name how we uphold white supremacy, and then to obey what we hope, moving forward into tangible action. Our hope calls us to listen to voices speaking truth to power. Our hope calls us to listen to one another. Our hope has called us to be present for one another in this season of isolation and challenge, to support each other as we grieve. Our hope has called us into creative community that's not bound to a building. Our hope calls each of us in different ways. It calls us to volunteer at the food pantry or the clothing closet, or reach out to a neighbor or hold space for one another. Our hope is calling us. Our hope is powerful. Our hope, if we obey it, will guide us farther into the light, creating beautiful and healing stories that our children and our children's children will hear when they ask us, what mean these stones? Speaking of being guided into the light, we have been searching for light out in the world. And I know each week as I settle in and listen to the beautiful music and take in your photos of light, that my shoulders relax and my breathing steadies, and it's a grounding moment. I hope it is for you as well. So now let's take a moment to breathe deeply. Maybe take the deepest breath you will all day, and bear witness to the light as Troy plays for us the photos you have been sending in all week.